Hi, everyone. I'm back with part 3 of Romans chapter 11 on the subject of the call of God is irrevocable. This is the last one in this series. If you haven't seen the first 2 videos, I recommend that you stop this video and listen to part 1 and 2. It's important that you listen to this teaching from the beginning. I hope it's becoming clear to you that my argument is that God saves all people. I am specifically focusing on the Old Covenant nation of Israel because they were the ones who were judged at the end of that age when the temple and the city were brought to desolation in 70 AD. The book of Revelation is all about their judgment. It's their story. Their judgment wasn't for the purpose of eternal damnation in a place called hell, as we have been taught, nor was their spiritual death eternal. Their judgment was restorative, not retributive. And if he did it for them, he will do it for all mankind. He is no respecter of persons. Their judgment was age-abiding correction, as it says in the Rotherham's emphasized Bible. It says, and these shall go away into age-abiding correction, but the righteous into age-abiding life. The Young's literal translation says, and these shall go away to punishment, age during, but the righteous to life, age during. Scripture teaches that though there was a partial hardening of Israel taking place in the first century, they were not destined to eternal damnation or eternal death, referring to annihilation, due to their unbelief. As I said in part 1, the partial hardening was for the purpose of evangelizing the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Paul says, in 1 Corinthians 15:22, for as in Adam all die, so also in the Christ all shall be restored to life. Continuing on with Romans, we start with verse 16. If the dough offered it as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. Did you hear what Paul is saying? If the root is holy, so are the branches. Why? Because it's only by the faithfulness of Christ and his finished work that anyone is made righteous, not by works. In this new covenant, Christ is the one who has entered into covenant with our Father, because he kept the law perfectly and they couldn't keep it. They were to look forward to what Christ would accomplish on their behalf, and we look back at what Christ has already accomplished on our behalf. Let's continue. Verse 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Well, that is true. They were broken off, but because of their unbelief. But you stand through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. Paul was warning the Gentiles not to be arrogant toward the natural branches, because it's by grace that they too are being saved, not because of anything they have done. And the hardening was only until the fullness of the Gentiles in the last days of that age would come in. I will show that when we get to verse 25. Carrying on. For if Paul did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. Being cut off meant cut off from entry into this new kingdom Christ had come to establish. Their judgment was physical and earthbound. It had nothing to do with their soul being eternally damned. Remember, their judgment was age-abiding correction. And verse 23, even if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? And verse 25, lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Notice this word until is not the same word until that Paul used in verse 8, when he says that their vexation wouldn't stop the very day they were of that day, but in day, meaning in that age, but was a continuance that was to last through the end of that age. The end of that age hadn't come yet, but it was coming soon in that generation. The word until has an end point. It means through the idea of a terminus, until or up to, or as far as. And compare it with the Greek word 3360. It means up to a certain point. And the word terminus means a final point in space or time. So there was an end point to their partial hardening. This word until is the same word used in Revelation 20, verse 5, which I mentioned in part 2. It was the end point of that age. The end of the 1,000 years was when the temple was completely destroyed. 20, verse 5 of Revelation. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. So according to this, the rest of the dead ones, spiritually dead ones, would eventually be restored to life. The timing would be completely up to God. They suffered their punishment when they went through the furnace of affliction on earth in Jerusalem. This was also the time when the fullness of the Gentiles would be complete. Because remember, this is about national physical in Israel at the end of that age. This was the end of them as a kingdom of people. The scriptures simply do not support eternal death. The scriptures declare an end to death. In this way, all Israel was saved. Their hardening was temporary. And Revelation 20, verse 14 says, and the death and the Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. This is all about that generation of ethnic Jews. And those people are not still alive today. There is no Jewish race today. At the time of their judgment, many were scattered into the nations. All of their geological records that were archived in the temple were burned up in the fires. Everything that made them a kingdom distinct from all other people was brought to an end. Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 21, 20 through 24, says, and when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea, which means it's local, a local judgment, flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. It was at this time that all prophecies in the Old Testament that were written for the last days was at this time when the temple was destroyed. He says it right there. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. There are no more Bible prophecies to be fulfilled after those days. Luke 21 verses 23, but woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people, which are the people of his generation. Because he was talking about this people that he was around in his generation. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. See right here in verse 24, the ones who survived were scattered into the nations, and they lost their identity. This new kingdom with this new covenant was not going to be about race, lineage, or DNA. It was a covenant with his son Jesus, and all who would join together with his son were the new Israel. It went from being exclusive to that physical nation of Israel to the full inclusion of all nations, to be entered in by faith through the preaching of his elect that were chosen in the first century. And again, not to the exclusion of the rest of mankind, but for the benefit of mankind. Though there was a partial hardening going on and they were being judged in the flesh, they were not eternally condemned. Listen to what Paul is saying to the Gentiles. He says, and in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish ungodliness from Jacob. And this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Okay, listen carefully to this next verse. Verse 28. As regards to the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards to election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. Listen, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Did you hear that? As far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved. For just as you were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. Listen, for God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. For other scriptures that speak about Israel's restoration at the end of that age, refer to Ezekiel chapters 16, 53 through 63. These passages of scripture that I am referring you to read on your own, specifically verses 62 and 63, also reveal the healing and restoration of Old Covenant Israel in spite of her wickedness. At the end of that Old Covenant age, rather than eternal death or eternal conscious torment, they were healed and restored. It says God will establish his new covenant with them, and then they would know that he is the Lord. Then they will remember and be ashamed, listen, when he has made atonement for them for everything they had done. Did you hear that? Everything they had done. It is at that point that one realizes they are lost or are being destroyed and that realization is a prerequisite to being saved. Remember, their punishment was age during, as Young's literal translation specifies. His atonement was sufficient for all the sin they had committed. Many will say, oh, but what about Revelation 20, verse 5? Well, let's go there. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The book of life is referring to the new covenant age they were getting ready to enter. If their name was not written in the book of life, they were thrown into the fire. That fire is the furnace of affliction, and its purpose was to bring forth gold. It was to purify. Like John the Baptist said, anyone who was not bearing fruit was going to be thrown into the lake of fire. This fire is not literal, it is metaphorical and is meant to purify. Because without purification, they couldn't enter through the gates into the city. As Revelation 22, 14 and 15 says, blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have right to the tree of life, and they may enter the city by the gates. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and the sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. This city is the kingdom established in the heart of believers by his indwelling spirit. His love is wide, long, high, and deep, and it transcends knowledge. The call of God is irrevocable. And because of the faithfulness of Christ and his finished work, all Israel was saved. As I said earlier in this video, 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, for because of Adam, all die. So also because of the Christ, all shall be restored to life. Now, if he did it for them with all of the things they had done, he will and has done it for all of mankind. God is no respecter of persons. Hebrews 10, verse 12 says, but when this priest had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. As it says in 1 Timothy 4:10, for in this also we tire in labor and are berated, because we have hope upon a living God, who is deliverer of all men, especially ones believing. It went from limited atonement exclusive to Israel to unlimited atonement and the full inclusion of all humanity. Yes, they must enter by faith, but even that is a gift of God to be bestowed upon each one in his time. It's by grace that we are saved, not of our own works. It's nothing we have done. It was Christ's faithfulness on behalf of humanity. And this truly is good news for all people. This is the end of my series, The Call of God is Irrevocable. If you like the contents of these videos and would like to know more, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and share this message with others, because this gospel truly is good news for all people. Thanks for listening, and may God bless.